Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion on future boardrooms, a conversation with public company board members on driving change. As we wait for people to join, please take a moment to write where you're joining us from in the chat so we can get to know you. My name is Heather Spilsbury, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at 50 with 50 Women on Boards. For those of you that don't know, we're a nonprofit organization committed to advancing women in the pipeline to corporate board positions. We do this through our quarterly and annual research, our board readiness workshops, events, and advocacy efforts. Our goal is to have 50% women hold corporate board seats and 20% of all the seats held by women of color. Today, we have an esteemed panel of public company board directors who will share their insights and experiences on how boards are evolving and driving change in the modern business landscape. As we navigate an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world, the role of a board is more critical than ever before. Today, we're going to explore a couple of topics. So, how board directors can promote diversity and inclusion in the boardroom, what changes they see in corporate governance and how board directors can spearhead inclusive recruitment, and how 50 Women to Watch for Boards can help reverse the lack of diverse talent on boards. With that said, let's meet our panelists to learn from their collective wisdom. Good morning, Pat. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Heather.
So great to have both of you here today. If you would, can you please introduce yourself? Pat, why don't we start with you, and James, you can follow.
Okay. My name is Pat Mulroy. I am the former CEO of the Water Utility and Water Resource Agency for all of Southern Nevada and lead negotiator for the state of Nevada for almost 30 years. And I now currently own a consulting company called Sustainable Strategies, and I sit on the board of Wynn Resorts, where I'm the chairman of the Nominating and Governance Committee, and on a second publicly traded company, Bowman Consulting, both of which are extremely diverse boards.
Fantastic. James?
Good morning. I'm James White. I'm the former chair and CEO of Jamba Juice. I've sat on public and private company boards for the last 20 years or so. I'm currently chair of the Honest Company board, and I'm lead independent director at a firm. And I have a consulting company, Culture Design Lab.
Fantastic. Thank you both for sharing that background. Why don't we start with the role board directors play in promoting diversity and inclusion in the boardroom? One of the questions I have for both of you is, how can board members hold themselves and their peers accountable for creating an inclusive environment that encourages diverse perspectives?
Who do you want to have go first?
Either one of you. We'd love to hear from both of you. I think you both have such great backgrounds that adding, narrative to this question is important because you have such different, paths to the boardroom. So it'd be great to hear from both.
And I'm happy to
go ahead, James. You start.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I don't think it's ever been more important for greater inclusion and diversity in the boardroom. If I look at just the last couple of years, the combination of the pandemic, the dislocation of supply chains, the global racial reckoning, there's never been a time where there's been a greater need to have a more diverse set of skills, a more diverse set of capabilities in the boardroom than today. And as I think about it, it starts with the board kind of skills assessment. The board matrix is how lots of people talk about it. And there's just a critical need to match up the company strategy and the dynamics happening in the external environment with the resources and skills in the boardroom.
Yes, and I think after looking at the matrix and discerning what skill sets the board requires, I think if the board then overlays a demand on the recruiter or on whatever mechanism they're using to find a board member, that diversity is very important, be it ethnic diversity or be it gender diversity, I think it makes a big difference. And because, look, we went from a board where I was the only female, and now we are 50% women, and every single chair is a woman.
That's great. That's fantastic. What we see from the research too is when there are more women or there's a woman chair, that leads to greater diversity also within the boardroom. So it's great to hear that that change was made on your board too, Pat. Um, this is a follow-up question to that. In what ways can boards or board directors leverage their influence to promote diversity and inclusion beyond their own companies?
I think you can do the kind of work that we're doing here. For me, I'm just an advocate for diversity in the boardroom and more women being included in the boardroom. I just think we can all bring people from non-overlapping networks kind of into this boardroom process. And that's what I love about the work with 50 women on boards. I think that's going to be one of the really beautiful outcomes is we bring our non-overlapping networks kind of into this conversation around board service. I also think there are some practical things that we can do just to make for a better board culture with the boards that we sit on, and make sure all the voices are heard in the boardroom, and that we find ways to bring our differences to bear to make an impact in the board conversations.
Yeah, it leads to a much more democratic process in the boardroom. I think you might agree, James, in the past it could be rather dictatorial in some board settings, and some voices were never heard. And I think that culture has changed dramatically to where everyone's input is being sought, at least in those companies that have fully embraced diversity and have fully embraced the need to change. For whatever reason they decided to go down that path. I mean, I agree with James. There's a real necessity for a company board to reflect its customers and to reflect its employees. If it doesn't, especially in this next century, it's going to completely lose touch with their audience and with their customers, and it is going to cost them dearly.
Yeah.
And I think we saw that during the pandemic, where the boards that were more modern in their governance practices and had much better diversity, they were more thoughtful around these really complicated challenges that we face today. And I think that's only going to increase moving forward. The one other point that I'd make, I think there is a generational shift where employees and customers are going to want to see more diverse voices in the boardroom, and that'll show up in policies and programming that has an impact.
You know, I think, for example, on our board at Wynn, I think the fact that we had a diverse board was in large measure a reason why during the pandemic, we decided we were going to continue to pay all our employees, both in Macau and in Las Vegas, irrespective of whether we were open or closed, maintain their benefits and pay their tips. And what it gets down to at the end of the day, whether it's within a boardroom or within the corporate setting, it's the need to show respect. You need to show value in your fellow board member, value in the employees that work for you. At the end of the day, that's what diversity and changing the board culture is all about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one of the things you also said, James, which I really appreciated, is that having the board members play a role in influencing that diversity by tapping into their network, so there's not any overlapping networks. So how do you do that? So specifically, this question could be for either of you, but if there is someone in your network you're looking to, on the flip side, what can people do to be noticed so that, and especially women and people of color, in terms of like making sure they're making those connections so that someone is in James or Pat's radar to say, oh, this is a perfect candidate for someone we should try to explore or bring in maybe for this opportunity or another?
I think if you involve yourself in not-for-profit boards, community boards, there's a lot of overlap there. And you see a whole different cadre of individuals that you can actually watch in a boardroom setting. That's the advantage of that. I think that's one of the great tools.
Seeing people in action. Yeah.
Seeing people in action in a not-for-profit or charitable board. I sit on the board of Catholic Charities, and
Yeah.
I sit on the board of Keep Memory Alive, and I can see exactly how people are behaving in a boardroom setting.
And I love that as a way to bring new voices and kind of have an opportunity to observe talent. There's also a lot of board development organizations out there like 50/50 on boards that people can participate in.
Yeah.
And I think that's certainly a way for folks that are aspiring corporate directors, but you have to be intentional
Hmm.
about, leveraging your nonprofit board experience, because many of the folks that you sit on nonprofit boards with, like Pat and myself, will both sit on public and private company boards.
Great. Yeah, that's perfect. We love hearing that too, because I think that's important. We tell women that all the time, about making sure that you're intentional about your ask, but also that you're putting yourself in positions where people can see your work or can validate what you do, whether it's in the boardroom or in your current role in your job.
And I
Um,
think that's a very important point, Heather,
yeah.
because there are any number of people who potentially could be great candidates for a
Mhm.
board, but who don't have an appreciation for what the difference between the C-suite and the board are.
Mhm.
And that differentiation is all important. And the more people can get involved either with NACD or with other organizations that, like James mentioned, to help educate them on what they need to bring to the table in order to be a viable and productive board member, I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's great. That leads into changes in corporate governance and inclusive recruitment. So, what changes do you see happening in corporate governance that are promoting greater diversity and inclusion in the boardroom?
I think the biggest thing that I see is the prominence around ESG, environmental, social, and governance related issues.
Mm.
I think have most of us in the boardroom focused on uh, being more diligent on both boardroom diversity, but probably as important, the diversity in our companies uh, where we provide oversight. So ESG is one of the big drivers. And then I just think the events of the last 2 or 3 years have really reshaped at least how I think we should think about modern governance. There are more different skill sets around risk related areas. There's more functional expertise, I think, required with the various challenges that we've all faced over the last 2 or 3 years. And I think in that challenge, it's created opportunities for non-CEO talent to be added to the boardroom. And I think that opens a window for deep functional expertise to be brought to bear in the boardroom. So as I think about any consumer oriented companies, the supply chain disruption has created opportunities in the boardroom for those kinds of professionals. Digital and cyber related
Mhm.
backgrounds really add a ton of value in most of the boards that I sit on.
I
Great.
agree wholeheartedly.
That's great. And how can boards ensure that their recruitment processes are inclusive and attract candidates from diverse backgrounds?
I think at the onset, if you are going to use a recruiter, you need to be crystal clear around
Mhm.
what you expect. Yes, you expect a certain skill set and you're really focusing on a certain dimension of ability, but
Mhm.
you are definitely overlaying it with diversity. I mean, we were very pointed in when we recruited 3 women, and we were clear, crystal clear, that those were the kind of candidates we were gonna see.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
very important. Go
yeah,
ahead.
I wholeheartedly agree with the point that Pat made. You've got to be intentional. You've got to actually be explicit in your expectations. Um, if I think about the Honest Company board, we've got um, um, a Latina woman who was the founder of the company, Jessica Alba. We have an Afro-Latina woman who is our CEO, and we've got over 50% women that make up our board at Honest, and all the board chairs are diverse.
Fantastic. In terms of the recruitment and beyond that, what do you? The question I have is what do you think that is the best step in terms of getting candidates? Do you think using a recruitment firm is ideal, or do you think you see more board members coming in to the boardroom based on recommendations from board directors?
I think it's both.
Okay.
I think it's a combination of the two. And the advantage of the recruiter is that he can organize, right? Organize the individuals, vet the individuals. But many of them that are given to the recruiter, because the recruiter may not have been aware of them, and that come from board members, will still be in that same pool of candidates and go through the same vetting process that the ones that the recruiter brings on board, go through. So it is a definite combination of both. And, I think that's where 50-50 women on boards becomes so important, because what it is it allows women to put themselves forward and say, this is something I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives those of us who are already on boards and understand what is needed to be an effective board member to pick 50 women that we feel are absolutely ready to join corporate boards, public company boards. And that becomes a resource to recruiters and to other board members that can access that list. So I think that is a golden opportunity.
And I think even beyond that list of 50,
Mm-hmm.
the folks that are, looking at candidates, we're probably going to see 6 times more candidates that we'll publish in this list. That also creates a very positive flywheel to create more opportunities for women on boards. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of the process.
Yeah, that's great. And for the audience who maybe aren't aware with what we're talking about a new initiative called 50 Women to Watch for Boards, which is something we launched on International Women's Day, where you can nominate yourself if you're board ready to be put on a list of the 50 finalists. And James and Pat are both on our selection committee, and we're so happy to have you. And this bleeds really nicely into this next set of questions, which you've answered some of it here, but what impact do you think this initiative will have on increasing diversity on corporate boards? And more specifically, how can lists like this help benefit amplifying future talent?
It will amplify future talent, because that becomes a resource to boards and to recruiters to access. And I think it also becomes a motivator for the individuals that are actually end up on the list, or the spin-off list, if you will, the second 50 or whatever number it becomes.
Exactly.
There is a hesitancy with some individuals on putting themselves forward, because they feel frustrated. They don't feel like there's a pathway for them. And I think if other women who aren't a part of this process, but who hear about it or who see it, it might encourage them to also step forward at some point and put themselves out there. And hopefully it will also encourage them to find out what it takes to be a board member.
And I just think us having this important discussion, Heather, so highest compliments to 50-50 women on boards. That's going to create, I think, positive change in the corporate governance world. Just by us having the conversations like we're having today, I think the list will be a culmination of that, but a starting point to what I view as just significant momentum to adding more diversity in the boardroom.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that's the goal of the list, is to help amplify this future talent for someone who's not already currently sitting on a public company board. And just because it's so important to put yourself out there, I think from a visibility standpoint, which is why I believe women should nominate themselves. And to your point, Pat, it is tough sometimes to put yourself out there that way and to ask for that type of recognition. But I think it's so important in today's world. We're so saturated with how we meet people, especially online. And I think it's important to ensure that you're making those connections and networking appropriately and strategically, so that you can help advance yourself, whether it's to a corporate board position or a global nonprofit, or even just in your own career. I think those things are so vital for someone who really wants to keep moving forward and growing within their aspect of what their expertise is, which is why we encourage women to nominate themselves. But why do you think women should go ahead and nominate themselves for 50 Women to Watch for boards before we close? Would love to hear your comments on that.
There is so much undiscovered talent out there, and women who have reached a certain point in their career and have become accomplished either in the C-suite and I was going to say this earlier, there is so much talent, for example, in the public sector. We now have 2 female board members, myself being one, who didn't have corporate background before we came on a corporate board, who come from the public sector. Well, that's a whole new dimension. That is a very different way of looking at the world that adds to the conversation. Those women being encouraged for them to put themselves forward and saying, yes, I think I'm ready for a corporate seat, I think it's going to make a big difference.
And I love that perspective, Pat. I'd add additionally nonprofit leaders. I've seen add tremendous value in the boardroom. And then I'd go back to the point I made early on, is bringing women from non-overlapping networks into this conversation, I think will only enrich board governance going forward.
Yeah, agreed. That is the goal for the initiative. So we're hoping that that's the outcome too. And I think there'll be a lot of opportunity for the finalists and even for semifinalists who have submitted their nominations. And again, just the visibility around it, find so exciting, because obviously we're here to help support corporations who are looking to diversify their boards. And a lot of times, it's a difficult situation to be in, because if you don't have board members who have the time to, build that recruitment like we talked about earlier, or you can't hire a recruitment firm, or, there's other things that come, get in the way, we know, with running a corporation. But those are some of the things that we're trying to mitigate and hopefully help to amplify talented females in the process. We do have one question from the audience that I want to throw out to the both of you. What sorts of skills are needed on boards that you've seen are harder to find? It's a great question.
Are those interpersonal skills? Are those board behavioral skills? Or are those technical skills?
Probably a little
I
bit
think
of both.
IT is hard to find, especially if you're looking for diversity at the same time. That is very difficult to find. But other than that, I still come back to, it's not so much the skill set, it is the demeanor and the ability to function in a board setting. And it is very different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, the high demand skill sets are going to be in the digital, cyber space. Supply chain is becoming in much greater demand, given the challenges over the past few years. And then I think, to the point that Pat makes, being able to operate and function as a value-added member of the boardroom team, because there is a culture in the boardroom and folks that really elevate the performance of that board in terms of their work on oversight, from a governance perspective, people skills, and kind of working in that fashion, and clearly understanding the difference of a line operating executive and a board member. Those are going to be different skill sets.
That's a great point. Fantastic. We have time for one more question. This question is, I'd love to hear more specifics about the skill set of nonprofit and governmental leadership that are value added to corporate boards. So assuming transferable skills from a nonprofit to a corporate board.
Well, let's take a nonprofit as an example. I mean, you have CEOs in the nonprofit world, right? Mm-hmm. And you have people who have been in senior leadership positions in the nonprofit world, or they have sat on boards in the nonprofit world. All of them understand that dynamic that James and I are talking about board interaction and how to function in that. And I think depending on what kind of not-for-profit it is, you bring the dimension of what you were working on in that not-for-profit world. Let's say homelessness, right? You
Mhm.
bring that dimension into the boardroom. You bring that sensitivity into the boardroom. That's important. The other is government. If government CEOs have know one thing, they live in a glass house. It used to be very much a closed club in the corporate boardroom, and people hated being investigated or seen or having to be transparent. That is second nature to anybody who has ever worked in the public sector. I mean, they know they live in a fishbowl. And bringing that dimension into the corporate boardroom, where you say, wait a minute, you have to have some level of transparency with your employees, with your customers, with those around you that you interact with.
And the only thing I would add to the point that Pat made, I think, is I think about both governmental and nonprofit leaders. They're going to bring a knowledge of local communities. If I'm a national nonprofit leader, I might bring an expertise around a cohort of consumers that end up being important to a particular board. I'm a fan of Girls Inc. That charity, you're going to have those nonprofit leaders that are going to really understand this next generation of potential consumers.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think also when you spoke about it earlier, just the dynamic in the boardroom is just so important to understand, and how that works, and where you offer your guidance and your opinion. On nonprofit boards, you're probably doing a little bit more work, but at the same time, I think it's being able to build that camaraderie with your other board members and directors to ensure that you're leading with the company in mind. Was a great point that I thought both of you brought up before. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see if we can sneak this one in. This question said, would my retired status, from pharmaceutical industry for so long be considered a negative in any way?
How long is so long? I don't think it would be a negative. I mean, it depends on the individual. It depends on what that individual brings and what that company is looking for, what that board is looking for in terms of skill set. Don't ever demean yourself or say, I can't do this because of X factor or Y factor. I wouldn't
Right.
do that. I would leave the door as wide open as possible, because whether it's generational differences, whether it is skill set differences, all those come together to really enhance the board dynamic.
Great. Well, that's a great response. I appreciate that. Well, that concludes our time for today. The half an hour goes by quick, and James and Pat, we just appreciate you so much for being here with us today and having this important conversation on diversity in the boardroom and how to recruit diverse candidates, and also for being part of the selection committee for 50 Women to Watch for Boards. Your insights and thought-provoking discussion have inspired all of us to work towards a more diverse and inclusive boardroom. So thank you in the audience for joining us today. We encourage you to continue this conversation with your own organizations and communities, and to support efforts that promote diversity and inclusion in all aspects of business. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.